Snorlax, still the best obstacle, Pokemon. Published on my website, accordionsprout.com, 27th of May, 2024. The Wikipedia article for Snorlax, not Bulbapedia, just so we're clear, has probably my favorite description of a Pokemon to date, as well as probably the best description of a frequently recurring video game design element. It reads as follows. Snorlax's most notable role in the Pokemon games has been that of an inadvertent roadblock. I shudder as I consider the fact I will probably, over the course of my life, never write a line as succinct and rhetorically perfect as that one. Life is made of such small tragedies. My misfortune aside, it's a perfect opportunity to finally write something about Pokemon. I may have mentioned it a time or two, but Snorlax is the best Pokemon. I'm comfortable writing that sentence and admitting to the full conviction that I will die on that hill. My passion for the fictional character has endured past multiple generations of the video game franchise, and while on some level my love for Snorlax is rooted in nostalgia, and another part in my personal branded meme, I do believe that there's an argument to be made for why this character has continually managed to be not just a staple, but arguably one of the best designs of the entire series. If my reader has never played a Pokemon video game, or somehow managed to avoid the franchise altogether, I'll provide a brief description. Pokemon is an adventure strategy role-playing video game published by Nintendo and developed by the company Game Freak. It was released originally in Japan as Pocket Monsters, with red and green versions available February 2nd, 1996, with the blue version being released in October of that same year. In the United States, where I live, Pocket Monsters would be changed to Pokemon, please don't ask me why, and only red and blue versions were released on the 28th of September 1998. The yellow version, which allowed you to have a Pikachu that followed you around outside of its Pokeball, and even surf on a little surfboard if you got the right one apparently, was released in North America on October 19th, 1999. That is my delightful little cat Jones, who is interrupting this broadcast. Where was I? Oh yes, discussing Snorlax. Pokemon was a smash hit, due in no small part because it was advertised well. It had cute creatures that you could collect. It encouraged healthy competition, and often not so healthy competition. And it generated literally billions of dollars in merchandise and sequel releases, which have only generated more and more fans. Whether it was the anime that ran on Saturday mornings, the playing cards which caused many parents, including my own, endless grief with trading scandals, or even just the video game itself, Pokemon had a mass appeal that endured, and throughout the entirety of the series, a somnambulistic, rotund creature known for its appetite and penchant for sleep awaited players who simply wanted to get to the Safari Zone to catch a Scyther. Looking back to my first encounter with Snorlax, I have to think briefly about a road trip. I hated trips to my grandmother's house, and my parents knew this because I never shut up about it. In my defense, it was a 5-hour road trip that ended in the city of Houston, a burgeoning metropolis famous for its various factories that polluted the air and pulverized my immune system, leaving me often a frustrated ball of snot and grief. That, and my other grandmother, my mom's mom, not my dad's mom, always got to ride shotgun and her cigarette smoke would float to the back seat. I suspect all of this is one of the reasons why I received a copy of Pokemon for my Nintendo Game Boy Color as a surprise the morning my parents picked me up from school early. Hopping into the car, I was expecting to play my copy of Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening for most of the trip. It was my first Game Boy game ever, and I was obsessed with completing it. Though, due to a glitch in the 7th castle, I never actually did. I would eventually beat the remaster for Nintendo Switch several years later. My mom and dad told me that they had a surprise for me, and when one of them produced the blue box with Blastoise on the cover smirking at me, I believe I made a noise comparable to the one Godzilla makes before he shoots an energy beam. The next 5 hours passed by in a blur as I would stumble my way through Kanto and eventually arrive at Cerulean City by the time I was at my grandmother's house in Pasadena, Texas, not California. A few days passed by, and I spent it mostly hanging out with my cousin Jacob, playing Super Nintendo, or looking for snakes in the ditch in front of my grandmother's house. Once we were back on the road, I continued playing the game, eventually arriving at Vermilion City. Somewhere between trading some NPC for a Farfetch'd, I always called it, I interrupt my recording immediately. I always refer to it as Farfetch'd D. Don't ask me why. I have no idea why. It's pronounced Farfetch'd, but my brain latched onto the apostrophe and the D, and so I went Farfetch'd D. I have no idea if anybody else ever called that Pokemon that name. If you did, please leave a comment in the description section below. Otherwise, I will continue to believe that I was an enigma and a freak for calling it that. I'm going to go ahead and start that sentence over again because I got sidetracked by that fun fact. Fun fact being in air quotes. Somewhere between trading some NPC for Farfetch'd and beating Lieutenant Surge with a single Diglett, I walked Ash over to Route 11, and resting at a three-way intersection was a fat oaf that looked like a human. Or at least, somewhat human. To be honest, my early memories provide just a passing impression, and the figure on the low-resolution and unlit screen was just a giant belly filling up the square of pixels I understood to be a navigable road and blocking my path to the Safari Zone where I was hoping to catch a Scyther. That's not supposed to be a running gag, either. I desperately wanted a Scyther because his character model was sick and I wanted one. I never did because I had the blue version, which means I would never be able to catch a Scyther, but I was able to catch Sandshrews, Bellsprouts, and Magmars, so it evened out. Kinda. It didn't. Magmar was cool, though, and honestly never gets as much street cred as he should have. Frustration settled in quickly after my initial fascination. I wanted to get past, and there was seemingly no way to. I tapped the A button, hoping the Pokemon would wake up, but I was only greeted by the same message repeatedly that read, "A sleeping Pokemon blocks the way." I even walked back to Vermilion City to purchase an awakening potion, believing that all I had to do was use it and that gargantuan beast would wake up. I didn't realize that that would only work on my own Pokemon and only if another Pokemon had used sleep powder or hypnosis on them. This was a painful lesson about how status ailments in role-playing games, RPGs, actually work. Snorlax remained unmoved and continued to sleep. Desperate, I scoured the regions of Kanto I had access to, and after talking to/fighting every NPC I could find, I figured out I had to get the hidden move HM cut and work my way through rock caves to reach Lavender Town and save Mr. Fuji, who would give me the Pokeflute. But that was only after I stopped Team Rocket's illegal casino operations, which were actually just pachinko parlors in hindsight, and all of this was a painful reminder that I still couldn't get to the Safari Zone to catch a Scyther. Snorlax was a fat Pokemon who blocked my path, and it wouldn't be until decades after I played the game for the first time that I realized and appreciated how he worked as a design. Decades before I knew the definition of the word Metroidvania, but only a few years before I would actually play a Metroid video game, Pokemon had taught me a video game structure design in the form of Snorlax. If my reader has never played one, the concept is simple. The player is given the ability to explore the world freely. However, unlike many of the current open-world video games, a Metroidvania creates obstacles that prevent a player from moving forward until they receive some sort of in-game item. In the case of Metroid, this is usually some sort of tool for Samus's suit, such as the missile launcher, morph ball, freeze beam, etc. Once the player acquires these items, they can overcome the previous obstacle and explore more of the world, find new missions, and generally progress in the story. I had experienced Metroidvania before Pokemon and other video games I had played, one of my favorites being Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, which was populated by frequent instances of similar obstacles. Certain stones couldn't be lifted without the power gloves, and even then they would only allow Link to lift certain stones. Rivers and lakes couldn't be traveled until I acquired the flippers from the Zoras, and then there were numerous hidden caves hiding rupees, new items, and extra supplies that remained unexplored until I had purchased or stumbled across bombs. And then, of course, there was the flute. And I interrupt this recording to note that sentence is a single line, and there's a hyperlink to an article I've written about the flute in Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, and I've also had a published article in the website Into the Spine about that particular side quest. I'll record that in a future date, I promise. For the time being, if there sounds like there was an extra pause there, it's because it was there by design. But, moving on. Pokemon does not have equipable items, apart from the bicycle, but it does have a level system that is designed to challenge players as they move forward through the game. The Metroidvania that's being employed by Snorlax then is less an effort to punish players for moving forward, but instead is simply a way to make sure the player does not wind up fighting enemy NPCs that are wildly above their level. To put it in perspective, anyone who even paid a slight bit of attention to Pokemon would understand a sentence like, "Dude, I'm gonna fight a level 30 Snorlax with my level 2 Caterpie." If that sentence made you laugh, or cringe, congratulations, you're a nerd. You're also a nerd who's probably played at least one Pokemon game. And I played a lot of Pokemon. One of the verbs of Pokemon is growing, or really grinding. In terms of RPG video games, grinding would mean fighting random NPCs until your characters would level up, thus allowing them to learn new moves, get higher HP, and be able to tackle tougher and tougher monsters. All of this jargon brings me back to Snorlax because he is, after all, a recurring character and design element in the Pokemon series, and his design is largely to encourage grinding. The first time a player encounters Snorlax in Pokemon Blue and Red, he's an impassable obstacle. No matter what the player does, they will not be able to move past him. This initially seems unfair, but the larger design of the game shows that Snorlax is placed where he is to make sure the player does not miss the chance to grind their Pokemon through more fighting, explore the regions they currently have access to, catch more Pokemon for their Pokédex, keep working through the main story, and ensure that the player does not simply jump forward and encounter enemies that will outrank them. By today's standards of open-world games, this design seems peculiar. Having played Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and accidentally walked into the path of a Linnell before I even had 6 hearts, I recognized game designers are more inclined to design complete freedom of movement for the player, allowing them to learn for themselves how to navigate the world. And there's nothing wrong with this. The 180 plus hours of Breath of the Wild on my Nintendo Switch demonstrates that I've enjoyed this dynamic. But looking back to Pokemon Blue and Red, I'm still impressed at how simply placing a large sleeping character in my path forced me to find a solution to the problem. By the time I had fought my way through Rock Caves, Team Rocket, and Pokemon Tower in Lavender Town, and received the Pokeflute, my team of pocket monsters had evolved to a point that waking Snorlax and capturing him wasn't just a possibility. It was a delight. Though I note, for the record, my very first run of Pokemon Blue had me simply wake Snorlax and then run away so I could fight my way to Fuchsia City to finally catch a Scyther. Spoiler alert! I learned from friends at school that I would never catch one on my Blue cartridge. This was a rather painful discovery, but I eventually got one. I just had to catch a Taurus and trade it with my friend Terrence. Snorlax would eventually become a staple of my Pokemon diet as I watched the anime on Saturday mornings, played Pokemon Snap on my Nintendo 64, and eventually caught one and realized that his HP levels basically made him an unstoppable tank. I played Pokemon Silver and Gold, and even my little sister's Crystal version, with her permission of course, and enjoyed seeing the massive sprite blocking the entrance to Diglett's cave. I played probably close to a decade's worth of hours of Super Smash Bros. Melee with my best friend Kevin and watched Snorlax appear from Pokeballs and body slam enemies. And in 2019, I found myself watching Pokemon Detective Pikachu with my mom and sister and getting annoyed that Snorlax only had a brief appearance. As in literally 1 5-second shot. What the actual fudge? Though I didn't say fudge. Snorlax is, by now, a recognizable intellectual property of Nintendo, alongside scores of other Pokemon. And while I freely admit my appreciation of the character is a sort of personal meme, I do believe the character has endured because it shows a care for concern for design in video games. There is no Pokemon in the original Blue and Red versions of the game that has such a literal presence. While other Pokemon hide in the tall grass waiting for the game's algorithm to spawn them into existence, or while some simply stand in place waiting to be interacted with, Snorlax sat in plain open sight impeding my path, completely apathetic to my existence. And, because he was impassable, I had to navigate around him, and eventually find a solution to moving through him. As a design element, Snorlax encouraged exploration, creative solutions to problem solving, and ensured that I actually played the game as it was constructed. Obstacles in video games do not have to be punishing, and Snorlax is a perfect embodiment of this fact. While some designers will create obstacles that will kill or destroy players, insert obligatory Dark Souls reference here, there is something to be said about an obstacle that is simply there and cannot be quickly dispatched. It's a credit to the designers of the original Pokémon who saw an opportunity not to punish players, but rather show them that sometimes they would simply have to find another way to press forward. My journey to catch a Scyther was blocked by a large sleeping teddy bear who soon enough would become far more interesting and arguably more useful than I could ever dream of. And when I learned you can make him dance in Pokemon Snap, well, I mean, how can you beat that? Joshua Jammer Smith, 27th of May, 2024. Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, as always, thank you so much for listening. I tremendously appreciate it. Like, you have your time on YouTube and you decided to watch me instead of watching Helldivers clips. Which, I mean, to be fair, Helldivers 2 is like flippin' rad, dude. I am obsessed with that game and I've already written something about it, so stay tuned for that, by the way. Anyway, you decided to watch this video, and I appreciate it. I really do. And I love you, whoever you are, wherever you are. Thank you so much for that. Now the rest of the obligatory stuff. Please like, share, and subscribe, all that mess. It helps me, it helps the channel, because one, it helps me get kind of close to the algorithm, or at least close to whatever close is, and whatever that flipping algorithm is, who knows. And then, you know, it also helps my self-esteem too, because as I've noted in previous recordings, I have criminally low self-esteem, poor self-image, and clinical depression. So, hey, it doesn't do a lot, but it actually does a lot. So please. Likewise, if you want to do something that actually helps the channel in a substantial way, I have a Patreon for this channel, and as a way of supporting my visual art, and as a way of supporting my writing. It is patreon.com/jammerdraws. You can find the link in the description section below. It has literally one tier, and it's $1 a month. That is because that's it. $1 every single month. So if you've got $1 you don't mind parting with this year, or this month, and then maybe $12 this year, please throw a buck in my hat. I would be immensely appreciative. But now with all that boring stuff out of the way, let's talk about Snorlax and why he is the best Pokemon ever. I'm serious. Snorlax is the best Pokemon. I don't care what anybody says. I know people are going to be like, well, his stats or this stat. I don't care about any of that. Snorlax owns. Snorlax is rad. Snorlax is the dude of dudes of Pokemon. Snorlax is just the best. Okay? And the fact that I have an enamel pin in my office of him eating ramen is all the evidence I will ever need to hear anybody say anything else about Pokemon. But, apart from just the sheer gag of the joke that isn't even really that funny, Snorlax is really interesting because of the way he is continually employed in the game of Pokemon for the purpose of creating obstacles. And, again, that's important, because when we consider obstacles in video games, it's a tad difficult, because like I noted, right now, the video game market is really oriented towards open world video games. It has been ever since the PS3 generation of games, ever since the Assassin's Creed began to basically turn into the Madden of action-adventure video games. Open world video games have just sort of blossomed, proliferated, and honestly, I think at this point might be a tad bit overexposed, but that's its own conversation. The point is, though, is that Snorlax is an interesting design because it is a reminder that when we consider Metroidvanias, which I just again explain in the essay as a quasi-open world game, Snorlax is one of the few examples where there is an obstacle where the function is not necessarily to use violence to overcome it. It's not necessarily about acquiring a specific tool that you can then equip for moving past certain obstacles. In order to get Snorlax, you have to find the Pokeflute. And how to get to the Pokeflute? You've got to get to Lavender Town, which involves navigating through the SS, and it involves beating Lieutenant Surge. It involves getting hidden moves that will let you move through the caves, cut grass, and then fight Team Rocket, and then all this stuff. Again, it's unnecessarily complex just to get past Snorlax. But at the same time, there's something really interesting about that. It's the idea of, let's just throw a Pokemon in the player's way, and they can't get past it. There is no way to get past this obstacle until we are ready for them to get past this obstacle. And that seems really counterproductive to what seems like a lot of general philosophy in contemporary video game design. So many, at least AAA titles, or sometimes to some extent even the indie scene of video game production, is endless concern for player agency. And what I mean is, we want to give players absolutely everything. We want to give them access to everything all at once so they can just play, which is not a bad design mechanic. And the fact that those games make literally millions and billions of dollars prove that people want to play that style. What I'm saying is, at the same time, creating obstacles to not inhibit player agency, but perhaps to make them have to reconsider how they are approaching or how they are moving through the game, is an interesting design mechanic, and one that I honestly don't see that much. To some extent, Snorlax is not as prevalent as he has been in other games. I believe the most recent, as of this recording, the most recent Pokemon games, I believe, were Pokemon Sword and Shield. And I believe Snorlax is an appearance in that game again, and as is typical fashion, he's just sleeping in front of a bridge, preventing the player from moving forward. But again, Snorlax is still being used by Game Freak, not because it's lazy writing, but because it works. It makes sense if this ridiculous, absurd universe filled with all of these bizarre creatures, electric mice, Pokemon that look like chandeliers and pine cones. It makes absolute... Hello again, Jones. It makes absolute logical sense that there would be just a giant, again, teddy bear who just falls asleep in front of a road, and at which point the player has to figure out, how am I going to get past this? Also, I apologize, the audio was a little weird there. I was looking down while Jones, my little butt head of a cat, Jones, was meowing at me. What more needs to be said? The consistent use of Snorlax speaks, in my mind, to an appreciation for structuring a game so that while it is about giving players interesting choices to make, it's not necessarily about giving players everything at once. It creates a challenge that players have to overcome. They have to explore. They have to talk to NPCs. They have to grind their Pokemon. In short, they have to creatively think and then just engage with the material of the game in order to overcome the challenge. And that's really interesting. And truthfully, in my mind, is the way you can really make a lasting game. Not just a video game, but a game, period. And sometimes, to some extent, even to a narrative. Because Ash wants to be the very best, like no one ever was. And the only way to do that is to find a way around Snorlax. How does he do it? Well, you've got to keep trying. You've got to keep moving. It's an interesting design mechanic. And I think I'm starting to ramble now, so I'm going to go ahead and cut it off here. Just to say again, Snorlax is the best Pokemon. That one line in Wikipedia is still one of the best damn sentences I've ever read in my life. And finally, this is really important. You, whoever you are, wherever you are awesome. And I appreciate you listening to my work and my voice and my writing. Thank you for listening. I tremendously appreciate it. Go play some video games.